2007 when I found my birth father's family through the Y-DNA test. And, that got me interested into other types of DNA testing and genealogy and things like that. And I realized that this could be a huge breakthrough for other adoptees, and nobody seemed to know about it. So I decided to do a website to tell other adoptees about this.
Welcome to DNA Clarity and Support. I'm your host, Brian. Listen as I chat with authors and leaders in the DNA world about the family and personal impacts of DNA testing. You'll hear news stories, unique perspectives, find out about books, websites, organizations, other podcasts for those involved in the world of DNA. Please be sensitive to younger listeners as the conversations can get intense at times. This is a production of Watershed DNA. Learn more at watersheddDNA.com. So today's guest on DNA Clarity and Support is Richard Hill, and we're going to be talking about Richard's personal story in his book, Finding Family, My Search for Roots and the Secrets in My DNA. But this isn't your only book, is it right?
Well, it's my primary book. I do have a Kindle-only book called Guide to DNA Testing. The Finding Family book is about my personal journey that lasts more than 25 years to find my birth family. And of course, it does get into my pioneering use of DNA testing to do that. And while there are many tips in there, it's not really a how-to book. So the Guide to DNA Testing is more of a how-to book, where to test book, some basic tips. It's a very brief book. It's just designed to get beginners started off on the right foot with the right expectations and taking the right tests.
Well, both of those sound like very important books. And I think your use of the word pioneer is definitely the right one in your case, because I remember when I first entered this world of genetic genealogy, there weren't too many books out there, but yours was one of them. And it's because you were the first person really that realized you could use a consumer DNA test and use it in a search for biological parents. Can you give us a timeline of how that came together in your search for biofamily?
Well, sure. My story is a little bit unusual, and I'll try to keep it very condensed. But I grew up not knowing I was adopted. And when I was 18 years old, I accidentally found out the secret that I had been adopted. But because I was about to go off to college, I was more focused on my future, and it just didn't seem all that important at the time. And then it was many years later that I actually started my search. I did identify who my birth mother had been fairly quickly using conventional means. And it turned out she had died a long time before, so I never got to meet her. And then I did find a brother, however, the one other child she had. And so I met my brother. We've been great brothers ever since. But the most difficult part of my search was trying to identify who my biological father had been, because I couldn't ask my birth mother. She was long gone. I did find many people who had known her, remembered her. Some of them even remembered men she had dated. And so I spent years off and on trying to chase down these leads and identify people, talk to them, eliminated a whole bunch of people. I kind of reached a point where there was just no really good place to go, because I had a list of people who might have been my father. They were all deceased. No one name stood out more than the other. And then I happened to have a genealogy friend tell me about the Y-DNA test at Family Tree DNA, and how he was using it to track his direct paternal line. And once I understood how it worked, I thought, well, wait a minute, I should take that, because if I get any matches on that, then there's a good chance that my match will have the same last name as my biological father. So that's what I did. And this was back in late 2006 that I took the test, got my results at the beginning of 2007. I had one name stand out as my very best match. contacted that person. He was in Florida. I'm in Michigan. And he had no recollection of anyone in his paternal line ever living anywhere near Michigan. So there wasn't any easy answer. But I did go back through 25 years of notes, and I found that one of the men on the list had the same last name as my DNA match. So that honed me right in on a suspect. Now, he was deceased, but I found a niece of his. She agreed to help me. Another complication came up in that he was one of 5 brothers. So all 5 would have had the same Y chromosome from their father. And they were all living at the time of my conception. They were all living in the same area as my birth mother. So it could have been any of the brothers. And ultimately, it was through autosomal testing of these men's children that led me to determine which man had been my father. Because a child of my father would be a half sibling to me. Children of the other men would be first cousins and would only share about half as much DNA. So that's how I was later and ultimately able to determine which of those 5 men had been my father.
Awesome. So I'll recap that for some of the listeners that might not be as familiar with the DNA testing yet. That there's different types of DNA testing that can be used for genealogical reasons. And back when you first did your first DNA test, the only test available for you at that time was the Y DNA test, only available to males because only males have a Y chromosome. And that helped you kind of narrow in on a family line, a paternal family line. But it wasn't until later when a second type, the autosomal DNA testing, became available that you were able to make a few more connections there to hone in on which brother out of the 5 in that family was your father.
That is correct. Unfortunately, that family accepted me right off the bat. So I felt like part of the family, started going to reunions and everything, even though, we kind of had the facts tended to point towards one brother. And so we kind of assumed he was my father. And we went along that way for about 5 years. And then when the other tests became available, got some relatives tested, turns out, whoops, that's wrong. It was actually one of the other brothers.
So it seemed more likely that one particular brother was your biological father. And then later the DNA testing, as it advanced and you were able to get more information from it, you realized that it was actually a different brother.
Yes.
Okay. Do you ever imagine how things might have been different if DNA had come along earlier in your search? Because up until that point in the 2000s, you were using all of the records that you could find and interviews with people that knew your birth mother. How do you think your story would have been different if the DNA had come along earlier?
Well, the obvious thing that jumps out to me is if it had come along a lot earlier, I could have met my birth father. He was actually alive for a few years after I started my search. But because with just the information I had, I could never identify him. I didn't, obviously I couldn't find him before he died. And the evidence strongly suggests that my birth mother never told him she was pregnant. So he never knew about me. So I think it would have changed both of our lives considerably if the testing had come along that early.
How have you seen things change for adoptees? And I'll use the term specifically for you. You were a late discovery adoptee. You weren't aware of your adoption until, sounds like you were a young adult.
Yes.
How have you seen things change for adoptees since you first began searching? And how did it come out to you that you were adopted as a young person?
How it has changed primarily is, of course, the greater variety of tests with the autosomal testing, which are both men and women can use. And those can identify matches who are related to you through any branch of your family tree. So you could find your mother's line as well as your father's line. And the other thing is the databases have gotten so much bigger. And because of that, adoptees and others searching for unknown parents are getting a lot closer matches. When the autosomal test first came out, and adoptees began to use them, a lot of times they wouldn't get more than a few third cousin matches. And while there were some success stories of people being able to work from third cousin matches to solve their problem, it was extremely difficult and tended to require months of hard work and genealogy research and spreadsheets and everything else. And now, because the databases are bigger, the probability of getting a closer match has gone way up. And while we still don't often hear about adoptees finding a direct match in the database to a parent, quite a few of them are finding siblings, aunts and uncles, first cousins, second cousins. I think it's much more common now for people to have found at least a second cousin, which makes the process from there a lot easier. And then to answer
faster, right? Because
faster, much faster.
Before you had to use like analytical skills on the limited match information that you were getting from the companies. So when we talk about getting a match, what I'm talking about is companies like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe and Family Tree DNA allow people who tested their companies to opt in to family matching or family finder services. And what happens is if you've tested at that company and so has someone who's genetically a relative to you, and you both opt into that matching, they will show up on your list of genetic matches. And then it's the top of the list are the people most closely related. And then it kind of, you scroll down and can see other people you're matching to, but just not as closely related.
That's an excellent summary, Brianne. And I'm so glad you did that, because I've been talking for so long and giving presentations on this on DNA testing to genealogists and adoptee groups and things like that, I'm going to use terms like that so automatically that I assume people know the basics. And a lot of people don't know the basics. And so I appreciate you filling those in. You also ask about how I found out that I was adopted. When I was 18 years old, just a couple weeks before I was going off to college, I started having a pain in my chest at night, and it was keeping me awake when I was lying down. And I wanted to find out what was on and get this fixed. And our longtime family doctor, the man who had taken care of me pretty much my whole life, had retired. And so I went and made an appointment with the guy who was a new guy to me, who had taken over his practice, had all the medical files and so on. And so I went into his office and described my problem. And he right away, he said it was acid reflux. It was just heartburn. And he began to think that stress might be the cause. So knowing that I had just graduated from high school, he asked me if I had been stressed out about getting good grades or if I was anxious about going away to college. And my truthful answer was no, none of those things were bothering me at all. So he opens up my file and he's looking through it and he says, well, and how do you feel about being adopted? Well, he assumed I knew that I was adopted. And at that moment, I did not. So that was the revelation to me, was in a doctor's office. And
does that memory stand out as something? I mean, it must stand out as a pretty big moment in your life.
Oh, absolutely. It was an earth-shaking moment. Unfortunately, it was in the middle of the day, and I had a summer job, and I worked that night. It was a retail job, and I worked until the stores closed at 9:00. So I had many hours after that to think about that while I was working before I went home. And in the end, I decided, well, my parents loved me. I loved them. This didn't really change anything. I figured they must have had their reasons for keeping this from me. And maybe if they didn't want to talk about it, I guess I wouldn't talk about it. And again, I was, say, less than 2 weeks from going away to college, and I was raised as an only child. And I could tell they were already a little stressed out about their only child, moving away from home for the first time. So I thought, well, I'm not going to lay this on them now and make a big deal out of this. So, maybe they wanted to wait. Maybe they're waiting till I'm 21 or something to tell me. So I'll just keep my mouth shut and not say anything. So I just went on and went off to college and ended college, got married, got a job, went on with my life. And I never forgot about being adopted, but it wasn't something that was really in the front of my mind. It was kind of a back burner fact, but I didn't have this overwhelming need to research it, nor did I think there was a way to research it.
Yeah, and maybe back in that time, there really wasn't a way to research it in the way that there is now. Some people, when they make their discovery about their parentage, it changes their identity or feelings about themselves, their self identity. Is that something that you relate to, or was you mentioned that it was something that was in the back of your mind? Did it ever come up with your parents that you had made the discovery of being adopted, and how did that conversation go?
As far as my identity, I don't think my identity changed a lot. I had several good things in my favor. I would certainly never recommend that people not tell their children this, that try to keep this kind of a secret. We were all very lucky that I found out when I did, because it was the perfect time. They said I was 18, I was about to go off to college, I was focused on my future. I was really just too busy and too involved to make an issue out of it. Had it happened earlier, say while I was 12, 13, that would have been a problem, I think. Who knows what would have happened to me at that time. And the other thing, I think by then, questions about, well, why would my mother give me up? I think by that time it was obvious to me, because I had girls I went to high school with that got pregnant. And the standard procedure back then was they quietly left town, went out of town for the rest of the year, had their baby, came back without the baby. And it was kind of obvious that a single mother, with no financial resources and maybe not even out of high school yet, that, they would have trouble supporting a baby on their own. So I kind of understood the factors that might have been at play.
How did that conversation go the first time that your parents were aware that you knew of your adoption?
Well, the first time is a very vivid memory in my case. When I hadn't even started my search yet. This was 14 years later after my discovery. I was 32 years old, and my adoptive father had a stroke, and he was half paralyzed, and it was affected his brain to some degree. And he was in a long-term care facility. And I used to go visit him several times a week during my lunch hour, because it wasn't, terribly far from my office. And we used to chat and talk about various things. And just one day, completely out of the blue, he brings up my adoption. And I had always assumed, first of all, that it was anonymous. I figured it was, they got me through some kind of an agency, and they had no information whatsoever about my birth mother. Well, that wasn't true. It turns out she was a friend of a friend, and she was a daughter of a friend type of a thing from the Detroit area. And my parents were living in Lansing at the time. And so they were contacted through these mutual friends to see if they were interested in adopting this child. And they were childless themselves. And so my birth mother actually came from the Detroit area up to Lansing and lived with my adoptive parents the last 5 months of her pregnancy. And then when the time came for the delivery, they took her to the hospital. I was born. They took me home. She went back to her hometown, and everything. It was a private adoption, already arranged and everything. And it certainly was not anonymous. So that was surprise number one. The second surprise was I assumed that, like the girls from my high school, that my birth mother had been very young, unmarried, and this would have been, her first child. Turns out, as my dad told me, my birth mother had been married. She had a child. She had a son. And then
An older brother to you.
Yes. And then she got divorced from her husband. And while they were separated and before the divorce was final, she got pregnant again for me, and she gave me up for adoption. So I had an older brother. So that was the biggest shock of all, to find out that I had a brother. And I never will forget my dad's words. He didn't just want to tell me that. He said, "I think you should find your brother." So
Wow.
he is actually the one that launched my search, because he told me this. He encouraged me to go find my brother. And that gave me something more concrete, to look for. The brother was a bigger motivating factor to me than just knowing the past and the details. So that's actually what triggered my search. And I initially started, and I did track down who my birth mother had been, and I did meet my brother.
I think that's a really big point, and a really powerful point of your story is that your dad encouraged you. That's one piece of it. But also it was an interest in tracking down the brother that you were not aware of existing before that. When
Yes.
you began your search, what was the reaction of other people in your life? Were they dismissive or encouraging or discouraging? Or how was that when you did decide to make an earnest attempt at tracking down your biological father? What were some of the memorable things people said to you during that time?
Well, first of all, I didn't want to hurt my mother. I was afraid, and I've heard other adoptees say this too, that if she knew I was searching, she would feel like I didn't love her. And that, of course, wasn't the case. I was just trying to find my brother, find out information about my past. So I chose not to say anything to her initially. And I actually never talked to her about it until after I found my brother. And then I did have a conversation with her about it. But I did start talking with some other family friends and relatives that were old enough to have been around at the time of my birth. And they had been part of a conspiracy my whole life. I mean, they obviously knew I was adopted. They knew that I wasn't to be told about it. But yet once I approached them and said, "Yeah, I know this, I found out, and I'm curious about finding what I can about it," they were very helpful. They gave me information about what they remembered. A couple of them I talked to had actually met my mother. One of them had met her at my parents' apartment. My adopted mother's name was Thelma, and one of them jokingly said the rest of the family referred to the apartment as Thelma's incubator.
That's kind of cute. I like that. Thelma's
Yeah, it was.
Like what you said earlier, she lived with your parents for the last 5 months of your
Yes.
pregnancy. That's unusual, and that's a pretty special part of your story.
Yeah, it was.
Thelma's incubator.
Actually, one couple actually had remembered meeting my birth mother, and this other woman had actually gone to the hospital when I was born. And I asked her, she was there the day I was born, and I asked her if she thought my birth mother ever saw me. And she was pretty sure that my birth mother never saw me.
Which unfortunately was common in those days.
Yes, I think it was. Yes.
Are there any misconceptions about DNA testing that you think people should be aware of?
Yes, there are several. So let's start with one. People commonly use the expression "DNA doesn't lie."
Yes,
and that's
that one before as
true.
well.
DNA doesn't lie, but depending on what kind of a report you are looking at from a DNA test and what kind of test you took, that information may or may not be terribly accurate. So let's kind of break this down. First, as far as close relatives go, if you took a classical paternity test between, say, a suspected father and a child, it gives you a definite yes or no answer. And that is absolutely accurate, and no question about it. If you do one of the genetic genealogy autosomal DNA tests that looks at a lot of DNA and measures how much DNA you share, And if that reports you as a close relative, parent, child, full sibling, half sibling, aunt, uncle, first cousin, even a second cousin, that also is very accurate. Out to the second cousin level, these autosomal tests are very accurate. Now, because certain relationships share similar amounts of DNA, you can't tell them, the DNA can't tell you which one it is. And a good example is half siblings will share about 25% of their DNA, but so will grandparents and grandchildren. They will also share about 25% of their DNA. And aunts and uncles will share that same amount with their nieces and nephews. So if you get a share about 25%, and there's certain variable ranges of this, you see three possible relationships. And the DNA alone is not going to tell you which of those relationships is correct. You do have to use, other information to find out, like the age differences, what you do know about your family trees, and so on. And usually you can tell which one of those three is the only one that makes any sense at all.
That's an excellent point. So the testing is accurate insofar as it can accurately detect shared DNA. But when it comes to reporting the relationship that DNA match indicates, there's room for interpretation, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. How you put it? Yes. And I also mentioned close relatives, second cousin and closer. Now, it will also pick up more distant relatives, maybe third, fourth, fifth cousins, or sometimes it just say distant cousin because it can't tell. When you're looking at distant relatives like that, it does mean that you share, at least with the closer ones of those, you do share a common ancestry. But because of the variability and the amount of DNA that's passed on, you can't be sure, for example, whether it's a third cousin or a fourth cousin. You can't, without further information, you usually can't tell whether it's on your mother's side or your father's side. There's a lot of details to be filled in. These are all clues, and some of the clues you'll never be able to figure out. But again, a distant relationship is not as definite as the closer relationships, the second cousin and closer. And then the last thing I'd like to talk about, a misconception, deals with ethnicity estimates.
Yes, I get questions about this all of the time. I'm really glad you brought this up. So people have questions about how accurate the ethnicity testing is and what exactly is it showing.
Yes, when you do one of these autosomal tests, they will compare your DNA with that of various reference groups that they have from different parts of the world. And then they will give you a percentage breakdown, like you're certain percentage Irish and maybe a certain percentage French and German and a certain percentage of Italian or African or something like that. These tests are very good at breaking down continental differences because those differences have been around. I mean, we all started in Africa a couple 100,000 years ago or more. People migrated and spread. Some came out of Africa and spread east into Asia. Some spread west into Europe. And over time, these mutations happened. And that's how they can tell what parts of the world, people came from. And the basic divisions of European ancestry, African ancestry, and Asian ancestry are pretty good. You can do that. You can break that down into percentages, and they'll be at least in the ballpark. And there are certain things that stand out distinctly. The original Native American ancestry, which they migrated to the Americas from Asia tens of thousands of years ago. That's pretty distinctive. And also is Ashkenazi Jewish is very distinctive because it's been a closed society where people have tended to marry within that same group for thousands of years. So that's pretty distinctive. But once you get beyond that and you're trying to tell French from German, English from Irish, things like that, it's still a guessing game. There has been so much migration in human history. There's also randomness involved in where you get your DNA. You might have, let's say you got 4 grandparents from 4 different countries. So you think, well, I'm going to get 25% from each country. No, you probably don't even get 25% of your DNA from each grandparent because of the randomness. I mean, you get 50% of your DNA from your mother. Okay. But which 50% you get is random,
Right.
which means you're probably going to get more of your DNA from one of your mother's parents than you are from the other one. So collectively, you're not going to get 25% from each grandparent. You're going to have some grandparents that you've got a lot more than that from, and some a lot less than that. And so that throws it off. So there are many, many reasons why these are very rough estimates. And I always tell people, don't draw any definite conclusions from an ethnicity number. I mean, let's say somebody takes this test and their father is 100% Italian blood, and they get their test result and they only got 10 or 15% Italian. And they say, well, that means my father can't be my father. Well, no, that's totally wrong conclusion. These tests are not going to do it that accurately. There's many, many reasons why you will not see the kind of numbers you're expecting. So I tell people never to draw any firm conclusions from an ethnicity result. They can at times be very big clues. Like if you suddenly get a whole bunch of Ashkenazi Jewish and your parents weren't Jewish, there's something going on, and a relatively recent relative. But
so I guess the way to say that is if your ethnicity is not matching what you thought it should, considering, not parent expected discovery is one possibility, but chances are it's more likely just a difference in the way that particular company has classified your DNA in terms of parts of the world where your ancestors were from.
That's right. And if you take several different tests, you will get different sets of answers, because each test uses a different proprietary algorithm for looking at your results. Each one uses different reference samples. Each one divides the world up in regions differently and again gives those regions different names. I have one presentation I do where I use my wife because she's a really good example, knowing that 50% of her ethnicity is Croatian. So I use her as an example. I've had her test on 8 different tests, and I've compared the results in a presentation I do on ethnicity. And it's very eye-opening to see how really bad some of these tests can be.
So for listeners that have not done DNA testing yet, or they've only tested at one company so far, are there guidelines that you have around which companies to consider reliable and which ones to maybe stay away from?
Well, there are 4 or 5 major autosomal DNA tests that you should consider. They are in order of database size. They would be Ancestry DNA, which has the largest database, 23andMe, which has the second largest, MyHeritage, the Family Finder test at Family Tree DNA, and then a British company called Living DNA is the smallest database. I always encourage people, and other people in this field do the same thing. The slogan you will hear is fish in all the ponds. And the reason for doing that is that these are 5 different tests with 5 different databases. And if you only do one test and your closest relatives happen to have taken a different test, you'll never find each other. So you really need to get into all the databases. Now, it's easier and cheaper than it used to be because 3 of those tests will accept transfers of raw data from the other tests. The 2 that will not are Ancestry DNA and 23andMe. So you have to take those directly. You have to pay. You have to turn in a sample. But once you have your raw data, you can take the raw data from one of those and upload it or download it to your computer first, and then upload it into the database for Family Finder, MyHeritage, or Living DNA. In a couple of cases there are small one-time fees if you want to use all their tools, but it's much cheaper than testing yourself.
You are just a wealth of information. And I'm going to mention your website right now. It's DNA-testing-advisor.com, because I imagine you have much of this advice also listed on your website. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yes.
Wonderful.
As I said, it was 2007 when I found my birth father's family through the Y-DNA test. And, that got me interested into other types of DNA testing and genealogy and things like that. And I realized that this could be a huge breakthrough for other adoptees, and nobody seemed to know about it. So I decided to do a website to tell other adoptees about this. And so that was why I created my website in 2008. And then I got involved with genealogy and went to some genealogy classes, and even found the genealogy instructors didn't understand DNA testing. So I thought, wow, a lot of genealogists don't know about this yet either. So I kind of broadened the focus of my site to include adoptees, genealogists, and really, anybody that's just trying to find out more about their family trees through DNA testing.
I wanted to go back and ask a little bit about family and how the DNA testing has brought you in touch with members of your biological family. So tell me, if you feel comfortable, what your relationships are like with your adoptive family members and your biological family members now that you're quite a number of years out from the search and discovery and reunion process.
Well, let's talk about my adoptive family first. First of all, the older generation is all gone from my family. I'm, among the older ones left, and it's just me and some cousins. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, parents, all those people are long gone. So it is, and my cousins have been very supportive in this from the beginning. And I have always felt that finding birth family does not replace your adoptive family, as long as you had a good relationship with them, which I certainly did. So to me, you're just adding on. It's not a replacement, it's just an add-on. And I really don't think you can have too much family. I think family is a great thing, and having more is good. So I continue to have good relationships with my adoptive family as well as my biological family. I just have a bigger family. I have more cousins. I have siblings now that I never had. I have a total of 4 half siblings, my half brother on my mother's side, and then 2 sisters and a brother on my birth father's side, and then lots and lots of cousins on that side. So it's been good, and everybody's been very supportive and welcoming on the birth father's family and birth mother's family, and it's just been a blessing.
That is so wonderful. When you began your search, did you have a vision in mind on how you hoped things would go? Or was it something that you went into with just open future?
Well, of course, my original vision was to find my brother. And I did do that. And we did have a very successful relationship. It was a little harder for him than it was for me, because I had known about him by then for years by the time I found him, and was anxious to find him. And he had no idea I existed until his aunt, who was the first person I contacted and who knew about me and had always wondered whatever happened to me. So his aunt went and told him about me and said, yes, you've got this brother. He's been looking for you. He's found you. And yes, he's real. I remember your mother giving birth to him. And he was shocked. He never knew his mother had had another child. So it was a little harder for him to get his arms around this. I think it was me. But once we got over that, it's been a great relationship ever since.
I'm glad, really glad to hear that. So you have the gift of foresight Richard. So I want to take an opportunity while I have you here is to ask you, what do you see as the best that's come from all of our advances in DNA testing? And what are some of the hazards you see for us in our future as a society or a culture when it comes to DNA testing and family searches?
Well, I think the best is that, of course, is for adoptees in particular. That's been my primary audience, and that's the group I'm involved in. It's making the databases get bigger, the tools get better. It makes searching easier, and there's been many, many more reunions. I know, of course, that reunions don't always go well. Not all birth parents want to be found, and I've always said it's kind of like a continuum. At one end, you've got, let's just talk about the birth mother, for example, usually the primary contact that you're looking for. On one end, you've got a birth mother who has just never stopped thinking about that child that she gave up, has always wondered what happened to that child, has longed to find out, may even have started searching to try to, from her end, to try to see if he can find out. Once that child becomes an adult, she may be just trying to search him and find him and searching unsuccessfully. She's just overjoyed when this connection comes. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got a woman who has tried to put this out of her mind, but still has this kind of what I think is an outdated feeling of shame. She's still very shameful that she got pregnant without being married. She's never told, maybe she's gotten married since then. She's never told her husband, never told her children. This is a deep, dark secret. She worries about somebody finding out someday and exposing her secrets and stuff like that. And when she, gets contact with the child, she's frightened and horrified and doesn't want anything to do with him. So those are your two extremes. And then you've got all kinds of people in the middle. And I think so many people in the middle, from my experience, are at least somewhat welcoming of the contact and willing to share information. And generally, I think in most cases, the contacts, go well. Obviously, there's cases where they don't. But I think more than half the cases, adoptees who contact birth families are going to have at least a somewhat positive experience. What I try to tell adoptees looking at this is you have a right to information. Okay, so you have a right to ask these questions and you have a right to contact these people, but you need to do it with great understanding and discretion. You don't know what you're getting into. You don't know whether these people have told anyone about the situation or not. So you have an obligation to be very discreet in your contacts, being very respectful, and hope to get the information. And then as far as any relationship that might happen subsequently, I say maybe you have a right to information, but you don't have a right to a relationship. The relationship has to build from both sides. It has to be agreeable all the way around. So get your information, and then if a relationship grows from that, hey, that's frosting on the cake.
Something you were alluding to when you were describing, the spectrum of experiences of birth mothers that have placed a baby for adoption. I think, we're starting to see and understand more about the trauma that adoption can have on relinquishing mothers and on infants and children who are placed for adoption. And maybe they've known their whole life, or like you, they found out later in life they were adopted. And then also the biological family that ends up getting contacted decades later that maybe weren't even aware of the child being born and adopted. And understanding, how do we support everyone who's in these situations so that there are the best chances of a successful reunion and long-term relationships happening, if that's what everybody wants. And something that I've recommended to most clients that I work with is making contact with a therapist or a counselor who can support the client, support them wherever they are in their journey. Because at the beginning of a search, the emotions and there might be revelations of trauma that come to light, and then later on, when contact has been made and relationships start to form, there can be bumps along the road, just like we have in any relationship in life. That it's hard work sometimes to create and establish a long-term relationship. So how do we make sure that everybody gets the support that they need so that the entire family and relationships within the family have the best chance of having a good outcome in the long run?
I agree. And I think what you do is wonderful and badly needed, because there are, like you said, there's so many outcomes, so many bumps along the way. I know I was very fortunate. I stumbled through this on my own. I had very good luck in the terms of the people I met along the way and how being helpful. I had good luck in that the families I found were very open and receptive. I didn't have to, overcome any real resistance. It was primarily just a search for the truth. And once I found the truth, I just kind of fell into good relationships with people. And I know this just doesn't always happen. And I also know in my case, because of the way I found out about my adoption and the timing of it all, I think I escaped a lot of the childhood trauma. When somebody knows they're adopted and they wonder their whole life, well, why did my mother abandon me? Where is she? Is she coming to get me? I never had those issues because I never knew or suspected that I was adopted. I don't know if it's a good term or not, but I say I don't have to carry a lot of the baggage that most adoptees carry. And I think for me, that has made it easier. But I'm sure a lot of adoptees who have struggled with this issue their whole life, and particularly those who got into adoptive homes that were not as ideal as we all would have hoped, boy, there's going to be a lot of issues involved. And I said in my case, I was lucky in so many ways. Like I was lucky I was an only child. I was raised as an only child. If my parents had had a natural child after me, and then I found out I was the adopted one, I probably would have looked back, and every time that I felt slighted that they had preferred my sibling, I probably would have thought, aha, now I know why mom and dad liked you better, because you weren't the adopted one. So again, I was very lucky in that sense too, that I didn't have any sibling rivalries to muddy the waters and add more potentials baggage that would be associated with my adoption.
Well, Richard, you've done such a great job in summarizing what are some pretty complex genetics concepts in our conversation today. And I know you've compiled a list of over 300 links, 300 genetic genealogy links that anyone can download from your website. So I'm going to include a link to that in the show notes for this episode, and also include all of your social media links, because I understand you're on Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn. And anyone who wants to find a copy of one of your books, so Finding Family, which is your personal story, that's available on Amazon. And your short Kindle book, Guide to DNA Testing, also is on Amazon as well. Are there any other ways that people can order your book if they're interested in getting their own copy?
Well, Finding Family is available through pretty much any bookstore. Now, the book has been out a few years, so it's probably not being carried in a lot of physical bookstores, but it has the necessary numbers and is available from a publisher and I can't think what they call them, distributors or whatever. So any bookstore can find and order that. So if you'd like to support your local bookstore, which I encourage you to do, just ask your local bookstore for it. And if they don't have it, they can order it for you and get it to you.
Thank you again. This has been a wonderful conversation. I appreciate all of your sharing of, what your experience was like and everything that you shared through your book. I really consider it one of the first entrances or entryways into the world of genetic genealogy. So I will forever be indebted to you, Richard.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad you enjoyed the book.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of DNA Clarity and Support Podcast. Head on over to watersheddDNA.com to learn more about the resources and support available for those involved in DNA discoveries.